In this section, we will analyze international aid, its uses, its history, and some of its pros and cons and how effective it is in poverty alleviation. First, let us distinguish between foreign aid and foreign investment. Foreign aid can be in the form of a grant, a concessionary loan, or a contribution from an institution such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or national development banks. Some forms of foreign aid do not need to be repaid, such as grants. However, others do need to be repaid, such as concessionary loans. However, these loans are usually repaid at lower interest rates and at longer repayment terms. Foreign investment is just as it sounds like. For example, when a company builds a factory in another country, or it can also mean the transfer of knowledge, expertise, or technology. History of international aid. Has international aid always been around? Well, no. There is some debate about when international aid actually started, but there is some agreement that it started in the 1950s, after World War II, when institutions like the United Nations, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund were founded. Since then, each decade has seen a different emphasis on aid. The 1960s, large industrial and infrastructure projects. In the 1960s, international aid focused on large industrial and infrastructure projects, such as building dams in Africa. The 1970s, poverty. The 1970s saw a switch in the focus of foreign aid towards poverty. This in many ways was prefaced by the Arab oil embargo, which caused the GDP of many nations to fall and inflation to rise. The focus of foreign aid during this period changed from large industrial projects to more of a focus on social services and rural development. However, despite the amount of foreign aid compared with the last decade increasing from 10% to 50%, the number of people falling into poverty actually increased during this period, some critics argue. Many of the loans made for social services were actually concessionary loans, loans which would need to be paid back. The 1980s saw a switch of focus to neoliberalism, a political economic theory which reduces government interference in social services and business, champions free trade and privatization. Multilateral aid is aid which comes from many countries or institutions representing many countries. This means that the World Bank and International Monetary Fund were more involved in the aid process. The focus of attention turned away from poverty and more towards reforming governments, helping, some would say coercing, developing countries to adopt free market policies. A free market is a market where prices are set by supply and demand, and where government interference is at a minimum. Again, critics would argue that this was a form of neoliberal takeover. Loans were granted on condition that neoliberal practices would be adopted. Practices such as minimizing the role of government, privatizing national businesses, and reducing the size of civil service contracts. The 1990s, good governance. With developing countries in debt of $1 trillion and with donors' interest wavering, the amount of foreign aid reduced from $17 billion in 1992 to $12 billion in 1997. In the 1990s, foreign aid focused on good governance. Aid was given on condition of good governance, the transparent rule of law, fixing corruption, and democracy. The 2000s, glamour aid and the UN Millennium Development Goals. It may be argued that the 2000s saw the rise of glamour aid, with stars such as Bono hitching their image on poverty alleviation. However, the period also saw the rise of smarter aid, with aid delivered by foundations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also targets set by the UN Millennium Development Goals.